I do want to thank the organizers for inviting me back to SOPSI. I have had an opportunity to be part of the program over, I would say, probably at least a decade, and maybe a little bit longer. And I've had an opportunity, therefore, to speak on a number of topics. And I can remember as the DSM was getting launched, to have an opportunity to talk about, if you will, the future of what DSM-5 might wind up looking. I also want to thank very much Professor Mai and Professor First for showing you some of the difficulties, challenges, and certainly criticisms that the DSM and the ICD have gotten and will probably continue to get. And part of this, as has been pointed out by both of them, has to do with the fact that our classification is, if you will, a representation of where the field is at a particular moment in time. And therefore, any criticism of the field is certainly more easily focused at times on the classification system and where that is at that point. So what I would like to do is share with you some ideas about where DSM has come over the last decade and where, in many ways, it will need to go in the future, some of which has already been pointed out by the previous two speakers. So, what I would like to do, very briefly, and Michael First has done a very nice job of saving me some time in terms of reviewing some of our process that we went through. After that, I would like to talk about some of the rationales that we used for the revisions that have occurred in the DSM-5. I do want to talk a bit about the table of contents, and this refers not only to the chapter organization, but other things that you will find in the DSM-5. And finally, I'd like to share with you, and perhaps if we don't have time at the end, because I'm probably standing between you and your cocktail and dinner, so I won't leave too much time, perhaps for questions, and perhaps over the next couple of days, I would like to get your ideas about what you see as key issues for our future. So, again, as has been mentioned, there was initially, I think, reasonable optimism that having a research agenda and having a series of conferences around the world focusing on key issues that cut across diagnoses and involved what we did know between 2003 and 2008 in terms of cognitive neuroscience, genetics, and neuroimaging, that might be informative in putting together the actual classification. And so we really had a unique opportunity to have these conferences around the world. As you can see, almost 400 people participated, and even though some people still think, perhaps even appropriately, that the DSM is basically an American issue, over 50% of the participants were people from outside of the United States, and as you can see, included people really from around the world who contributed mightily to these conferences. The topics of these conferences are listed for you, and It is not only the 10 monographs that have been published on the basis of these conferences, but really the 200 or so peer-review articles that emerged, which formed a very important database for thinking about what changes might be appropriate for the DSM-5 and perhaps for the ICD-11. Now, when we began the DSM-5 process, which really occurred now 2006, 2007, or a little more than 5 to 6 years ago, we used the same 13 work group structure that was used for DSM-4. And as you can see, the topics that were chosen covered really the disorders that were listed and discussed primarily in DSM-4. And I've also listed for you the chairs of those various groups. And I don't think there were any surprises looking at these particular groupings, other than I do want to point out that, as I will further in a second, that similar perhaps to DSM-4, there was the importance of involving not only psychiatrists, but involving clinicians from other disciplines and other areas of medicine. And this is even reflected, for example, in the neurocognitive disorder area, where Ron Peterson, a prominent neurologist in the United States, was actually one of the co-chairs. And this continues your listing of the 13 work groups and the chairs, again, not terribly different at all from DSM-4. Now, if one looks at the distribution and representation of the 160 or so members of the task force and work groups, a couple of points I wish to make. First of all, as you can see, the representation was not simply individuals in the United States, and I think it was extremely fortunate for us to have many individuals from outside of the United States who participated as work group members and members of the task force. Also, although I would say that it was not as good as I would like, you can see both the gender representation and also the race and ethnicity of those individuals who worked in the various work groups. In addition, I should point out that if one looked at the discipline area of the members of these groups, one would note that there was actually more than 20% of the groups, of the group actually included academic and clinical psychologists. The other thing that I think it's useful to point out is that in addition to this group of 160, there were really, at last count, we would probably say that we had something to the order of 400 individual advisors who also worked on the DSM-5. One of the things that we did in moving forth with the DSM was to construct study groups that, in a sense, cut across the work groups in order to ensure that certain areas would receive important attention. One of these has to do with what ultimately led to the chapter reorganization, and this was a work group, study group rather, that was chaired by Steve Hyman. There was a lot of emphasis on thinking about lifespan developmental approach, and here we're not talking simply about development until age 18. We are really talking about development across the entire lifespan. While there had been some previous emphasis on gender and cross-cultural issues, we wanted to ensure that even more attention was given, and therefore, in a way, 2 study groups were formed in these areas. One of the difficulties that we saw that needed a greater deal of attention was to try to integrate what we're doing with the rest of medicine. Hence, there was a study group that was formed really to look at the psychiatric general medical interface, and this group also gave us a number of recommendations about what we probably ought to begin to do in the primary care area as well. One of the major issues as well is that impairment is used to be often a standard criteria for our psychiatric or mental disorders, while in the rest of medicine, that is not necessarily the case. And so we've begun a revisit to the whole idea of impairment and looking at the best way that we can measure that. And finally, similar to previous efforts, we really are looking at what different and what changes in the diagnostic instruments need to be made in order to approve our assessments using the DSM-5 criteria. Now, let me briefly go over some of the revisions and rationales for what happened. As has been mentioned by others, it's very clear that 20 years later, the organizational structure of the DSM-4 does not take into account a lot of the work going on in internalizing and externalizing disorders, as well as other work that has been carried out. And so consequently, as I will point out again in a moment or two, the restructuring of the DSM-5 reflects a better set of interrelations within and across diagnostic chapters. Secondly, we've already discussed, and you've heard earlier, about, in a way, our strict adherence to categories may lead us in some interesting ways. First of all, they may be the wrong categories. Second of all, if we don't think about things in dimensional or quantitative or continuous measures, which is what we do in most of our efforts in the rest of science and neuroscience, we again are losing an opportunity to provide a better way of thinking about diagnosis. So here again, one of the things that we've done in the DSM-5 is to think about a better representation, which might, in a sense, reduce our reliance on not otherwise specified diagnoses, which, while it will not be completely gone, we do believe that some of the changes that have been made will reduce the use of those different distinctions. I've already mentioned to you that a lifespan perspective is much more consistent with thinking about development and change across the entire lifespan. Also, cultural perspectives, while discussed frequently, really need to get a much more, if you will, strict look. And so, in many ways, the DSM-5, in terms of its structure and its criteria revisions, will look at age and development more consistently, but also allow one to provide a cultural formulation in thinking about specific disorders and the various cultural variations in symptom presentations. We've discussed many limitations in our current diagnostic system, and certainly we will see the same, to some extent, limitations in the DSM-5. It would be wonderful to take full advantage of the wealth of findings from neuroimaging, genetics, cognitive research, and the like that have emerged over the last 15, 20 years. But at this point in time, we really do not have the sensitivity and specificity of these findings to be routinely used in the current diagnostic criteria. And perhaps the best way of thinking about it is that we've provided a better alignment to integrate findings that hopefully will emerge in the next 10 to 15 years that would allow us to revise aspects of the diagnostic nomenclature without having to wait 20 years. Now, the multi-axial system in DSM-4 was not necessarily required and often not used. And we had considerable discussion about what to do in DSM-5. And at the end of the day, if you will, what we have recommended is that DSM-5 be moved to a non-axial documentation of diagnoses. And so, for example, Axis 2, which had personality disorders and mental retardation, has now moved to Axis 1 along with other psychiatric conditions. And Axis 3, which had to do with documentation of medical disorders, really, by its, if you will, lack of an Axis 3, all disorders are on the same plane, which is really one axis. We've provided opportunities to document psychosocial factors and contextual factors, but we've also felt very strongly to re-examine, as I've indicated earlier, the whole issue of disability. And here, we do believe that we will be able to take work that has consistently gone on at WHO and ICD to consider the individual's functional status separately from their diagnosis, or more importantly, their symptom status. Let me briefly mention something about our table of contents for DSM-5. Section 1, we really want you actually to read it. It is not something that's there just because you need an introduction. We hope that the introduction and the use of DSM-5 are two sections that will allow one to understand the rationale for changes, and also, from an educational point of view, how really to use the diagnostic nomenclature. Section 2, as Michael has already referred to, is a revised chapter structure, sometimes known as the metastructure. And part of this, throughout the last 6-7 years, has really tried to address a number of questions. Could a new chapter organization improve utility and perhaps even validity? Secondly, would it stimulate greater activity among imaging, pharmacology, and even epigenetic research? Could it help, at the end of the day, align, as you've heard, some of the interesting efforts that are beginning to emerge from the NIMH Research Domain Criteria Project? And finally, and not to be, if you will, thought of as unimportant, but in fact very important, has been the whole issue of alignment and harmonization of ICD-11. Now, I'm not going to go through the individual chapters because Michael has kindly done that for you, but I do want to reinforce the notion that what we tried to do was to think about a clustering of different groups of disorders that might facilitate further work. And that has to do with the neurodevelopmental disorders. And then next to that, what we often think about as either the emotional or internalizing disorders, then the somatic disorders, and after that, the externalizing disorders, and then the neurocognitive disorders, and finally, personality disorders. And of course, there are more chapters than just these 6. They represent perhaps sort of super chapters. So without going over the same material again, just let me point out just a few things for you. As has been mentioned, the whole notion of putting neurodevelopmental near schizophrenia spectrum and putting schizophrenia spectrum near bipolar is not an accident at all. It has to do with where we see fields continuing to emerge, both clinically and scientifically. The idea, of course, of putting bipolar and depressive disorders next to each other makes a great deal of sense, and in many ways, putting depressive and anxiety disorders next to each other also makes a great deal of sense. We gave the opportunity to separate out a very large grouping of anxiety disorders into 4 anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive, trauma and stressor-related disorders, and dissociative disorders. The only group that had trouble dealing with its independence, not surprisingly, although they pushed very hard to get it, was the obsessive-compulsive group, who took a long time in deciding whether they really wanted their independence. And as we say, and I don't know the best Italian term, they obsessed about it for a long time. We finally said they had to have their own chapter. And as is indicated, the other chapters are grouped around issues of somatic symptomatology, then gender dysphorias, and then the grouping of externalizing disorders and the like. And again, I won't spend a lot of time going over that. Now, section 3 of the book, we look to have that as, again, a very active section of the book, and not simply to be thought of as an appendix. And particularly, there are a number of things there that I think you will find of interest. One is the potential use of a variety of cross-cutting and dimensional measures. Secondly, is an alternate DSM-5 model for personality disorders. And the third are conditions for further study. I've also alluded to the fact that you will find there a cultural formulation as well as a technical glossary. Now, this notion of not waiting, I think, has to do with the fact that our advances will not be even, and we do need to take advantage, if there are appropriate advances, to make changes. And I should mention that having the advantage of an electronic online DSM will allow us to be able to make some of these changes without necessarily printing a big new book, if you will. We also see an opportunity, without waiting 20 years, to make other changes. There may be some unanticipated events, if you will, in terms of changes that have been made in DSM-5. I think we have done a reasonably good job of assessing what we think likely prevalence changes may be. But of course, you can't anticipate everything. And it is also possible that some of our criteria are not as clear as we would like them. I've mentioned to you that the electronic versions will really be able to help us. One of the things that we need to think about is how to continue to integrate psychiatry with general medicine, and whether a primary care version is the way to go. Secondly, are there, in doing this, more easy strategies for assessment of the most common disorders that we could provide in such a smaller package? Obviously, we need to determine which disorders. We need to determine whether there should be a pediatric and adult separate version. We need to determine whether it should be printed or online, and what are the levels of assessment that need to be included. In thinking about the development of a 5.1, what are the guidelines that need to be developed for change? What are the thresholds that would represent a reasonably high bar for change when we're dealing with criteria? And this, of course, may come from some of the work that's going on in science. It may also come from other directions of epidemiology and clinical studies. I've already alluded to the fact of unanticipated changes that may take place as a result of DSM-5. We also want to, of course, see what goes on with all the formal Section 2 disorders. I should mention that the electronic version of the DSM-5 contains references. DSM-4 did not. DSM-5 will have the references on the electronic version, and you will also be able to get the actual papers on this electronic version. We also want to watch Section 3, particularly conditions for further study. And I think that, let me go to there already because I've really mentioned that some of these disorders, such as you heard attenuated psychosis syndrome, is one of the 8 or 9 disorders that we want to monitor and see what goes on, and whether there is some evidence for moving it either to the main section, or whether there is actually a lack of evidence and it should be moved even off Section 3. We've mentioned again and again the need that DSM and ICD represent forms of communication, and part of those forms of communication and education and training will obviously be carried out in guidebooks, case books, but also, I think, the use of apps. The electronic age has emerged, and most of us will not only get our information, but it's very likely that we will be doing our assessments through this kind of information. The Section 3 as a research tool, again, let me just point out, in addition to attenuated psychosis syndrome, there are a number of other disorders that are listed. Each one of these disorders does have a criteria set attached to it. I point out to you also that at the end of that, there are 2 sets of disorders, suicidal behavior disorder and non-suicidal self-injury, which are also in Section 3, which I hope will receive some attention so we can make a decision about whether it moves or stays, if you will. The alternate DSM-5 model for personality disorder is somewhat different than the DSM-4 sets of criteria for personality disorder, which essentially remain in DSM-5. But this alternative model also includes a much more extensive notion of level of personality functioning and personality traits than we had in DSM-4. And finally, I do know what the cover of the book will look like. It will be coming out in May 2013, which is really just a couple of months from now. It will be released at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in San Francisco, and followed up very, very quickly by the electronic version for DSM-5. It's been a long journey so far, and the journey, as indicated by our two previous speakers, is certainly not over, and I would say that the next 5 to 10 years will continue to create both ferment, activity, and perhaps even some resolutions of some of the diagnostic problems that we continue to have as we look for better ways to assess and treat our patients. Thank you very much.